Hello and welcome to the 9th video in this Twitter integration video series. In this video I'd like to cover working with and creating and defining archive control menus. What I mean by that is when I select one of these items in the archive control, I'd like the ability to right click and show a menu that I can select an option from. For example, if I go to the person archive, I can right click on a person and I will receive this context menu that allows me a number of actions to take on that menu. Also, if we go to the activities tab, let's see if we can find a company with a significant amount of activities. Okay, so it helps if I select all of the options here for entities. To look in this activity list, and I see several different types of activities, well in this case two. I see an appointment and I also see a sale. Notice if I right click on appointment, I have a predefined list of items to select from. However, if I right click and select sale, you'll notice that I get actually a couple more options that were not there with the appointment. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at how to accomplish those sorts of context menus inside the 6-web environment. Before we leave this screen though, I also want to point out the differences between the rows that we see here. For example, this is an appointment row, right? It's shown when I have the follow-ups entity selected. So equate that to that this row belongs to or is an entity type of follow-up or an appointment. Whereas this row right below it is of type sale. It's a sale entity, right? And if I uncheck the sale entities selection checkbox, then I'll no longer see the sale records or rows in the archive control. It's very important to understand that the entities assigned in the archive provider to each archive row is very significant when it comes to the context menus that are displayed when you right click on a specific item in the archive control. We're going to take a look at how to define those menus for each entity in Visual Studio in the configuration files. So I'll switch over now to Visual Studio and let's get started. So here I am in Visual Studio and I'm looking at the SO menu configuration.config file. I'll scroll down to line 2281 because this is where we begin to define the menus for archive control context menus. The keyword that we use in order to define a archive control context menu when a row is selected is by using the context keyword archive list. Remember, we were discussing about the different context menus that were available for the different entities or the different selected rows based on their entity type. And those entity names are tightly coupled to the subcontext keyword. I think that bears repeating, so let me say that again. For every context menu that we show in a archive control, when you select a specific record, that record has a unique entity assignment to it, right? For example, an appointment has an appointment entity assigned to it, or a follow-up. Sale row has a sale entity assigned to it. So conversely, we have to create a menu definition for each entity type we've created for our Twitter archive. Those entities are, of course, as we defined in the constructor of the archive provider: friends, own, public, and mentions. So let's go ahead and begin to create our own menu system. This one's actually quite long. Remember, this was the one that we saw when we selected the person. Project. How about this one? It's not so large. We're going to essentially chop it up anyways. So I'm going to come back up here to the top, and we'll leave it within the same area of where the other archive lists are defined. So I want to go ahead and just leave myself with 1. And let's take a look at the definition here of this menu. So it has the context, and I told you that in order to get that context menu to appear, it has to be of keyword archive list. The subcontext maps to the entity name assigned to a specific row. So let's choose friends in this case, right? Because we have entities in our archive provider defined, one entity defined as a friend or friends. The ID is going to be 0. The position that we want this context menu to appear is below the cursor. The group that this belongs to is the archive group. The other groups such as could be main menu, for example. And whether or not we want to display the access keys. In the first menu item, generally you'll give it an ID that is similar to the subcontext that it applies to. So we'll say, friend, new. And I want to leave this resource hint as is, because it's going to be a string resource for the menu system, for a menu list, and it's going to be new. And the URL that I want to show, I don't actually want to do a new project. How about we just go ahead and show a message to the user. So we'll say, okay, alert, and then hello from 6web. Great. We can also assign an icon to it. Now I want to go ahead and add a icon that corresponds to the new option. So I've just copied and pasted this link from the images, tool icons, and mini add passive GIF file. We don't have any rights associated with this, so we'll just take this away. And then we want to see if this will actually work. So archive list, we've got a subcontext for friends, so that means anytime I select a friends row and with a right click operation, then I should see this new menu appear. So let's test that out. I'll go back to 6web. I'll just kind of refresh the archive control. I don't actually think that was necessary. And I'll select a friend. So I'll right click on a friend, and now a new menu item appears. If I click new, it will tell me hello from 6web. That's great. Now if I scroll down and I notice one from myself, now I know that's not a friend, so if I right click it, nothing happens. So I get to this little white square that means absolutely nothing. So I'll come back up and I'll right click on another friend, for example, and then we see new there as well. So let's take a little closer look at this. Now that we're using Firefox, I'm going to drill down into one of these rows with Firebug. And I'm just going to select any item in any row, because I just essentially want to get into the TR element. So I'm going to scroll up, I'm going to take a look at the TR element. I'll scroll over here so that we can see this, and we'll see that this row entity name equals friends. And this is the key that ties us to the subcontext in the archive list menu element. What else can we do here? Well, let's look back here in Firefox and see what else we have. What other type of information we have here. If I look, I see this is the table rows 13. This is the counter, which is actually inside the archive provider, is providing this the primary key number, if you remember, 13. Oh, but look here, the row type nav equals Twitter, tweet ID equals 13, and if you recall, these items were getting set inside the archive provider as well. So they actually end up in the archive control on a record as the row type. So row type equals, and then that string that we had set. So this tweet ID is 13, which is the value given from our counter, and then the tweet name is the actual value, or the tweet ID, the long value for this tweet from Twitter. If we look at the archive provider, we'll switch back over here and we'll see the exact line that was set on. So we'll drill down into the archive provider, So we'll drill down here into add rows. And here's that assignment where we're adding in a link hint. So when we add the link hint, that comes back into the actual archive control as a row type. Great. So nav equals specific ID, which is coming from provider name, and then we have the tweet ID coming from the counter, and then we have the item. Excellent. So Twitter is always going to be the nav hint, and then the row entity is friends. We can actually get these values that we assigned to the tweet ID as well as to the tweet name. We do that by leveraging this syntax known as like a replacement tag. So if we go back into our solution, and I'm going to open up the SO archive control link infos types config file. If we scroll up to the top, we can see that we can actually get some replacement tag values by using this type of nomenclature. Control ID, for example. But we can also see that how it's being used inside some of these actions when they're on the JavaScript is executed based on if it was a single click or a double click operation. I'm looking down in here and I can see, okay, here's one for mail item ID, here's mail folder name. So that tells me that if I come back and I look at my, let's go back to our menu definition, I can say hello from 6web. This is tweet ID, and then let's go ahead and plus that. I'm going to scroll over for you. We'll do some angle brackets, and now let's get the actual tweet ID. So I'll save that. We'll come back to 6web. I'm going to get rid of Firebug. I'll right click, choose new, and now you can see it says hello from 6web. This is tweet ID 14. Okay, that's great. I'm going to come back into our application. I want to create a new menu item here so we can look at something else. So we'll say I'm on a friend, and this will be like retweet, because this will actually become the retweet menu item. And for the icon we need something different, so I'll use this button forward passive. And now we want to look at the tweet. We can say, okay, this is the archive ID, whereas this is the actual tweet ID, and remember that's stored inside name. So I'll save that. Now we'll go back to the web page. I'll right click on our friend. Now we have two items. If I choose new, I see the archive ID is 15, but if I right click again on that same one and choose retweet, it says the actual tweet ID is the actual Twitter ID. But how else can these replacement tags be used? They become very useful when we want to update the currents within the system, and that's important because we leverage currents quite extensively inside our data handlers and code behind files. See what the current sale ID is, see what the current appointment ID, and in this case, see what the current Twitter ID is. The way that you update currents, though, require the use of a JavaScript page update method. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that works. We're going to do that by switching over to the SO archive control link info types.config file. And we're going to do that by specifying a new link info element. So I have that available here on the clipboard, and I'll just paste that in. If we look at this, we want to kind of pick this apart so that we can explain it a little bit better. The type for a link info maps to the nav hint that you specified inside the archive provider. And then the subtype defines whether or not this is going to be for a click or a double click operation for a row inside the archive control. Next, we get to the actual base URL element, and this is where we issue the JavaScript page update method. This is encapsulated within a string. Page update takes two parameters. The first is the SO protocol string, and the second one is a callback if a callback is required. None is required in this respect, so all we want to do is access the Twitter archive control, make sure that we do not refresh it by saying refresh equals false, and then we're going to set the tweet current equal to the replacement tag value. So we're going to say tweet ID equals to tweet ID, and using the ampersand here, tweet name equals the actual Twitter tweet ID, the long value, and that's inside the name. We're not going to specify a target in this case, so that's all we need to do in order to create a link info element. This is a bit of a tricky spot, so I want to go ahead and reiterate this just a little bit and make sure you draw the connection between the link info type, in this case Twitter, and how that gets mapped to, if we go back to our tweet archive provider, how that gets mapped to the nav link hint specified in our row link hint. Okay, so we're setting this nav equal to the provider name, which if I scroll up to the top, you'll see that is set to Twitter. So we're linking those two things together. Okay, and then we set the tweet ID and the tweet name, and these are the values that are being pulled from our replacement tags in our SO protocol. So those values are actually being pulled from the control and then placed inside the tweet current. Right. So as long as this is set correctly, we have to make sure when we make changes to this file that we reset IIS. So let's go ahead, our changes have been saved. We'll reset IIS, and then we'll go back and refresh the page on 6web. Okay. Now I can select any one of these values, and what's going on underneath the covers is that it's currently updating the tweet current. So how can we tell that that current is actually being updated? We can do that by switching back over to our code, and I want to add in one new menu item to our available context menu. I've added in this menu item ahead of time, and I said, okay, this is going to be for a friend's current, and I'm going to call it get current, and the actual JavaScript I'm going to alert, and I'm going to use the JavaScript Ajax method dispatcher in order to synchronously call and get the current from a server-side Ajax method. I'm going to get the current for the current tweet, and then from that current I just want to specify the name, which should actually be the Twitter's assigned ID value for that tweet. So if we go back to the website, I right click on this item, I can say new, that will give me back the archive ID, that's 30123, and then I can specify retweet, and I'll get the current Twitter's tweet ID 8439, and then if we right click and choose get current, then we'll see from that Ajax method it's actually getting the current ID from the current system, which was updated by simply clicking on one of these rows. If I right click on this one, I call get current, now we get back the current from the current system, no longer pulling it out of the link type attribute. Now if we come down to one of my mentions and I select a mention, remember if we right click on here, we don't actually get a menu because I don't have a menu defined for mentions. So I want to come back over into our menu configuration, and now I want to create a new menu for mentions and see how that reflects our selections inside the archive control. So I'll just simply copy this. I want exactly the same one, but this time I'm going to call this mentions, because now I actually want to look at my entities, my mentions entities. So I'll come back to the page, and now I should be able to right click on one of these where I've been mentioned, and in fact I can. Now if I choose the menu below, I'll get the archive ID. If I choose retweet, I'll get the tweet ID. Now if I say get current, I'm going to get the current 5761. So the currents are being pulled from the system and they are being set. However, it should be noted that my Twitter archive provider is specifying the Twitter nav link to each one of these rows. So nav equals Twitter for every single one of these rows. And that limits my capability to specify actions I want to take when I do a single click or a double click operation on each row in the archive control. So if we go back to the archive provider and we change our nav hint here to equal the entity being passed into this method, so that will be public, mentions, friends, or own. So I'll say entity, and now that link hint is going to be specific for each one of those values. We can go ahead and rebuild this project. You'll see it will be redeployed. I'll have to come back to the website, and I'm going to refresh here, and I want to show you the consequences of not aligning the link info elements with the nav assignment. Back in, and now when I click on one of these records that are from my friends, I'm going to select the retweet. We'll see 8439, and then if I select the get current value for that same item, nothing is happening at this point because there's no connection between this current system. There is no current that's able to be retrieved from the system. So it's actually underliningly, I guess it's throwing an exception and just aborting the operation. So let's go ahead back to our control link infos type, and now we're going to change this to friends. Right, now this is going to actually be tied to a specific entity or row where the nav equals, yes, friends. So let's save this. I'm going to go ahead and do an IIS reset one more time. Now we'll have to come back to the website and log back in. Now if I select one of these options and I say get current, the current is being displayed for a friends row, 2884 for this one from Hanselman. If I go down to one of my mentions where I've been mentioned and I select that row and then I say get current, notice it still says 2884. So it's still the same one regardless, because I'm not actually updating the current value because I don't have a link info element specified for my mentions entities. So that brings me back to our link infos definitions, and I'll just copy and paste this shamelessly, and I'll say mentions, correct my spelling, then I'll switch back to the console to reset the service. Now I'll log back into the website. And with that, if I select the third row, I'll say retweet, get the current 7395. I'll use the Ajax method to get the current 7395. If I come down here and select one of my mentions, and then I right click and choose get current, it is now 5761. So now the currents are being updated for the mentions as well as for the friends. So the conclusion here is that we want to make sure that when you are working with the archive control, you want to pay specific attention to what you're doing in the archive provider, specifically with setting up this nav link hint, and make sure that this is going to be the same as the entity name that the row belongs to inside the archive control. And then that way it provides additional flexibility here when you're specifying link infos to the actions that are taking place when you click or double click that row of that entity type. And then back in our menu configurations, we'll see that we also have additional menus that we can specify for the different menus based on their subcontext, and the subcontext is going to map to the entity name. So I hope that this video was useful and enlightened the way that the menus work within the SO archive control. Before I wrap up though this video, I want to go ahead and talk about one more type of menu that we have within the archive control, and that's specifically down here the buttons that we get displayed for the operations such as add, delete, etc. that you normally see on the company tab, right? So we got delete and filter. If we go to the contacts tab, we'll have add and delete, etc. So this is one additional thing that might be defined as a menu. It's actually a toolbar, which is defined inside the archive controls XML element. Let's go ahead and switch over to the Twitter page configuration file and specify a toolbar. So here we are inside the Twitter page, and I'm going to come underneath the menu into the config element, and I'm just going to add in a new line, and it's in the config element where we specify the toolbar that is assigned to this archive control. So we'll just go ahead and start typing in toolbar here, and then I'm going to add in a new button. So I'll say button. Just going to move the position a little bit, and let's bring that down. Actually, all of the assignments are attributes, in fact. So we'll say caption equals, and I want to use a resource in this case because I know that there's an add resource already available. So it's a string resource and add. Great. The next attribute is essentially going to be for the tooltip. Okay. The next one will be the icon is going to be displayed when it's actually just passive. So give me a second, I'm going to fill in some of these properties for when the image is, passive, when it's selected, when you hover over it, and then also when it's disabled. Okay, now that that's done, we have of course some action that we want to associate with this button. So in that case, we're going to tap into the onClick event, and we're going to say something very simple like JavaScript and then alert again, just to show a message. And then we'll say add something. I'll come up, we'll save our changes. We'll switch back over to the website and we'll just refresh the page. I'll just F5 to refresh the page. And now you can see that we have a new add button on our archive control. If I click the add button, we'll get the message box that we expect. So, although not a menu, the toolbar is an additional functionality within the archive control and deserved mention in this context. So, again, I hope that you enjoyed this video and began to understand some of the complexities and flexibilities involved with creating an archive control and leveraging an archive control within your application. In the next video, we're going to talk about creating a new dialog that will associate with actions that we take both when we select a option from the context menu, also the same action when we click on the buttons within the toolbar. We'll see you then. Happy coding!